Well, I first came to Ladakh in 1975 when it had just been opened for tourism, and before that it had been completely closed off for political reasons. And I was coming out as part of a film team to help film this exotic and unknown land, and thought that I would spend just 2 months, I think, at the most.
That was Robert Gardner?
No, this was for the German film team.
Right.
And I had a job in Paris working in linguistics and thought I'd be returning back there, but I became so interested in Ladakh and also in the language that I decided to stay on when the film was finished. And at first I was going to do a PhD on the language, and I worked with local monks, well, Paldan, whom you've met, I think, or you'll meet, and Tashirapkes, who's now working with us here. And did a dictionary of Ladakhi and so on. While I was doing all of that, I was walking through this whole region into Zanskar and so on, and I found myself as almost an ambassador of the sort of Western culture, because I was the only foreigner to speak the language, and so people were always asking me about my country and what it was like in the West, and did we have mountains there too, and also what was happening was that with tourism starting, they were getting a very distorted picture of life in the West. They got the impression that every modern person was on a constant holiday, never had to work, and that we were made of money. And they didn't realize that we came from a very different economy and a very different world. So I found myself always explaining about this. And I also found that the beginnings of the development that was starting looked as though it would be very destructive of both the culture and the environment. And so I started writing letters to the government, to the Indian government, trying to persuade them to use a different approach, and especially recommending the small is beautiful or Schumacher approach. And I actually wrote to the Prime Minister about 2 or 3 years after I'd been here, and got a response and interest, and then got a connection in the Planning Commission in Delhi. And then I was able to start on a very small scale a demonstration of the sort of development that seemed to be appropriate. And the thing that seemed to be most needed was heating, because that was the only thing that people might ever complain about in the villages, was the fact that it was very cold in winter. And it turned out that Ladakh is really the best place in the world for solar energy. They have almost constant sunshine and about 320 days of sun a year. And
not as good as Perth.
but they have also at the same time almost no fuel traditionally. So in the development and with development and in the modern sector, coal and hard coke was being imported, and that had to come way across the Himalayas from India. It was terribly expensive, and also the whole process was very polluting, both dragging the stuff up here and using it. And it was only available to those few people who were lucky enough to get a job in the modern sector, earning money all the time, so that they could spend money on importing coke. So the solar alternative seemed to be a very good demonstration of a different type of development. One which was more ecological, one which took into account the local conditions and the local problems and tried to do something about that. So that was how this project started, and now over the past 8-9 years, a very large and quite a significant section of the Ladakhi population has become very interested in the work of the Ladakh Ecological Development Group, which I helped to start. And we have the so-called King of Ladakh working with us, and people from all sectors of the society. And I think we have a chance of having an impact. I mean, we've already had some impact, to the extent, for instance, that the government this year, and also expressing their sort of gratitude to us or appreciation of what we have done, they are starting now to subsidize trom walls, which is this space heating system, and also greenhouses. So we are having an impact. However, the goals of the project are very ambitious. I mean, the sort of ultimate goal is to try to do everything to protect the best of the traditional culture. And that also means in the social sphere, a society where crime and violence is almost unknown, aggression of any kind is virtually non-existent. A society that's based on cooperation instead of competition, and one in which a profound respect for all forms of life has been a part of their history for centuries. And so we are hoping that they're going to be able to move into the 20th century. We don't think it's possible for Ladakh to shut itself off, to build a wall around it. That seems to be totally impossible. But we're hoping that by bringing in a lot of the experience of the rest of the world, more information about how development has in fact harmed many areas, both the cultures and the environments. Also how even in those very wealthy industrialized countries, such as America and Sweden and so on, there are now many problems because of industrialization. They're environmental, certainly, very clearly the pollution and so on, but it's much broader than that. They're also social. So we're trying to bring as much information as we possibly can to Ladakh as quickly as possible, so that the development alternatives and choices will be based on much more informed and conscious basis. I should maybe tell you more about the traditional culture.
Yes. I was wondering, people might ask not about what you mean by the best of the traditional.
Yes.
They're going to say, is this a Western notion of what should be preserved?
Yes.
Or is it a Ladakhi view?
Yes. I think when I say the best of the traditional culture, I think we have to assume, which is very difficult in modern society that has been so colored by positivism and scientism, which really doesn't allow for any value judgments whatsoever. I think I'd like to try to, make a plea for common sense and yes, for judgments and values.
Yeah.
And I think there are basic values such as peace instead of violence. Also, a peaceful relationship with one's natural resources, one in which one doesn't exploit and destroy the natural resource base, so that it's very clearly will be very diminished or damaged for future generations. So there's the concept of sustainability, which is very vague, certainly. And yet, if one uses common sense, one can very clearly see that the way the Ladakhis lived traditionally for hundreds of years was not perfect, and one can't say that it was in complete balance with their
Only hundreds of years?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, I don't want to get into debates about just how long it's been or what was here. It seems fairly clear, the evidence is fairly clear that it has been Buddhist for 2,000 years. When I talk about the stability, the relative stability of the society, it's something which, again, would be very, very difficult to prove. We base everything on statistics. Where would they come from? There's very little evidence. And yet there's certainly evidence going back a couple of hundred years based on the reports of missionaries and so on who were here that shows that there was a relative stability. But
so
I think above all, what I base my statements on is what I have seen with my own eyes. So that what I'm contrasting is the life in the villages as I experienced it 11 years ago, speaking the language fluently and able to communicate with the people. What I experienced then with what I have experienced now and the change that I have seen with my own eyes. So I prefer to try to base my arguments on that because I have so much evidence there already. Even though I have not, spent a lot of time trying to quantify it and so on, there's plenty of evidence, and there's, I think for anyone with a bit of intelligence and common sense, it's very clear to see.
Yeah.
So I won't. So the relative stability that I'm talking about in the traditional society was very closely connected with a worldview, an underlying belief about how life works, what the role of human beings is in a context of the universe ultimately. And that was based on understanding, or at least a constant reminder from the religion of the interdependence of everything. So that in Buddhism there's a law of dependent origination, which says that absolutely nothing has an independent existence. Everything is dependent on ultimately everything else. And
This is very like a sort of European medieval worldview too, isn't it?
it's very like the European medieval worldview, but it's also very much like what I would call a post-industrial worldview. And so the post-industrial worldview is one which has been based on an understanding, I would say, primarily of the mistakes that we have made in gradually evolving a worldview in which we thought that human beings were totally separate and supreme and separate from the rest of creation, and had the ability through their intelligence and knowledge to foresee the outcome of all their actions. They were in control, they were masters. And I think now over the last decade or so we're becoming a little more humble. We're beginning to realize that often the manipulations, the changes of the natural world around us that have been brought about primarily because of science and scientism, or whatever you want to call it, often have brought unexpected results and unanticipated consequences. Now, if the worldview had been more holistic, as it were, or should I say systemic, to start with, then those consequences wouldn't be unanticipated, because there would constantly be a more profound and humble understanding of the fact that we're always dealing with this very complex web of relationships, and when we pull one thread we affect the whole. But this new thinking in the West is in fact coming back to very old truths which have been around in most cultures in the world, and that information is a very important part of our project, to bring that to Ladakh. And so, for instance, there's also, even among physicists, there have been parallels drawn between Eastern philosophy and mysticism and quantum physics. And in fact, one of them, Fritjof Capra, is a very good friend of mine, and I have, his books and papers and so on. I brought them here to Ladakh, and what that's doing, among other things, is showing that this traditional worldview, which of course in certain respects may be limited, certainly limited in terms of the knowledge of other societies, but in a profound understanding of the essence of life and the sort of basic principles of life, it's very sophisticated. And so we are trying to show that in order to try to strengthen respect for the traditional society and for the basic principles upon which it was founded. Should I continue?
Violence and non-aggression has been achieved. How do they achieve this in their children, for example?
It's very interesting. I mean, again, so hard for me to start because I see it as being connected to so many different aspects of life. But to start with the children, I did a sort of a study. I mean, I spent a summer just observing childcare and just that relationship. And it was fascinating to see how patient the parents were. How also, when there was a need to reprimand a child, and sometimes that meant even slapping a child or shouting at a child, stop that or whatever. It was so clear that it wasn't in anger. That is, the child very clearly had the sense that the parent hadn't lost his love for the child. And at first when I saw that, I would hear a mother, shouting at a child or maybe giving him a slap or something like that. And then the next minute, cuddling him and stroking him. And at first I thought, oh, that must be very confusing to the child. But then I realized that of course it wasn't, that the message was that I love you and that love is unconditional, it's always there, but you shouldn't do that.
Well, most people, that goes back to what you were saying about the scientific worldview, most people would assume, probably from Skinner, that would be a terrible thing to do.
Yes, terrible thing to do, yes, yeah. And, and certainly if you progress as we have, poor us, I mean, I feel so sorry for us, to try to find out, through books how to treat our children. We've lost a sort of continuum and traditions where we've been able to learn gradually and slowly from other generations and being around children, how to care for them. So here we are frantically reading books. And of course, purely rationally and logically, it does seem rather confusing. But I think ultimately, again, the sense of what is right and basic common sense and human values will tell you that love And that means, real love. That doesn't mean you never reprimand a child. It's of utmost importance, of course, for children. But I think what I also experienced then was that the mother, of course, she was very patient. But then when I compared her with what I had seen in the West, it wasn't so strange. I mean, she wasn't under the same time pressure. She herself was never, if the child was crying, for instance, the only person responsible for it. Or I shouldn't say never, but very, very rarely. There was a whole range of individuals there to help care for the child. And quite automatically, without ever being asked, the grandfather would take the crying child, the sister, the other children, neighbors, and even total strangers, who would be coming into the village, so that the child was being reared or raised by a whole range of individuals. And so the pressure on the parent is, of course, something that contributes very greatly to then, passing that on to the child, tension and pressure. And a very important factor, too, is personal insecurity about, who am I, in a sense, to sort of prove yourself. Here you found individuals who really had what you might call either no ego or an expanded ego, part of a much broader whole, and very relaxed about who they were. And, of course, again, I think this plays a tremendously important role in passing it on to the children.
I was going to say that this rings true, it rings very familiar with me, but one of the things that strikes me about traditional societies that operate in that way is that children also have this relationship with their parents, that they know that their parents are training them to a pattern of life which is stable too.
Yes.
So they have a close relationship with their parents, who is acting as an educator.
Yes, that's right.
In their adult role.
Yes.
And kids in Greece, in traditional places, express that if you ask them.
Yes.
They'll say that.
Yes.
Whereas, what do you think? I mean, about that?
Yes, I think again, to me, one of the things that's been very important about that too is that it's not been just the parents, that educators have been every child and every adult older than the child, so that you find a very decentralized, informal education going on all the time. So that in a sense, the parenting and the education isn't just focused on these sort of, two individuals. You don't have this tight little nuclear unit, which I think inevitably almost has to become too intense and sort of sick in a way. So I think that pressure that we feel in the West just doesn't exist in a more traditional context. And then, of course, it is ultimately, I think, very closely linked to a whole economy, a whole way of life, which also is relatively stable, where you don't have the sense that, tomorrow is this ear of corn or this kilo of barley still going to be worth a kilo of barley. I mean, barley is barley, and you eat that. You don't have to feel the pressure of inflation and diminishing resources that you now feel in a Western industrial context. I personally feel this ability to try to compare and contrast traditional indigenous societies with the industrial society is very important, and I think we have a lot to learn. I mean, it's been said a lot, but I don't see us doing too much learning.
That's what anthropology is about.
Yes, it should be.
Yes.
It should be. I don't see it as actually doing that most of the time. But anyway, I also, when I talk about the sort of virtues of the traditional society, I just want to also very clearly say that to me, over these past years, it has not at all meant that I've seen the Ladakhis as somehow superhuman or wonderful or noble. On the contrary, I don't want to say on the contrary either. I just want to say that what I have come to admire, in a sense, and feel worthy of study and to some extent as much as possible preservation, is the whole system of interactions, the whole society, the way it's a pattern which has, conducted and helped to perpetuate relationships both between people and between them and their resources and the land. And that has seemed very sophisticated and very sensible. However, the individuals within that context have more than being virtuous and noble, have simply inherited this. I mean, they've been born into it. And what I see now happening as this fabric and pattern breaks down, as the traditional society becomes threatened, is that those individuals behave just the way we do when they suddenly find themselves in a different context, or even worse, I would say, that as the traditional way of doing things breaks down and the new, which has not been thoroughly understood or learned, and also a new context which is throwing people into a competitive context instead of a cooperative one in which it suddenly seems as though there's absolutely no limits to resources, no limit whatsoever, because it's only a question of how much money you earn in lei, for instance, then you can import rice, you can import everything that you need. And so suddenly a sort of wisdom or understanding of where that food comes from, that in turn is dependent on the climate and the whole cyclical nature of reality, is lost completely. And I see people now in the sort of modern context becoming, in a sense, very immature, and partly because the information that they have about that new and modern way of living, about the new and modern way of producing food and so on, is often very limited. And so a very important part of the work we're trying to do is to, again, to bring more information about that. An example of that too, I mean, for instance, earlier we were talking about the water. And in the traditional way of life, for instance, water was protected and kept absolutely clean. You could drink out of streams anywhere. Well, I shouldn't say any streams. I mean, in each village there were certain streams that were designated for drinking, and they were kept very clean. And water generally was treated with great respect. Now, this was all the time reinforced by the religion, which is a Buddhist religion, but which is based on what came before that, ultimately an animism, that is a respect for the spirits of the earth and the spirits in the water. So you would never dirty the water. You wouldn't even dream of spitting into it. You wouldn't wash clothes in it, because you would anger the spirits. You wouldn't suddenly just dig into the ground and build a new house. Of course not. You would first have to have a special ceremony to appease the spirits of the soil, to make sure that they agreed to or that they were taken care of before you just went digging into their earth, which they inhabited. So all the actions, including also taking life, for instance, killing animals to eat meat, that again wasn't done wantonly or recklessly. Very consciously, you knew you were taking a life and you knew you shouldn't. So it was done with lots of prayers of forgiveness and so on, of the life that was taken. Now you find in the modern context that in lei the water is becoming filthy dirty, that the people with a modern education who haven't been imbued with those Buddhist values are throwing rubbish into the streams. It's becoming filthy dirty, and much dirtier than in the West, for instance. And I think that contrast between the traditional way and this modern way is something that we need to understand better, generally.
You talked before about sort of altruism and reciprocity.
Yes. But also, as part of that, what I said before was that I don't think that people are necessarily noble. And I think, in fact, what I've seen is that they've grown up in a system, in a culture, in a way of life where reciprocity and cooperation was a way of life. And you see, what I have discovered there is that people prefer to help one another. That if we have a choice of living in one way or the other, or in two different situations of either affording to help other people and cooperate, we prefer cooperation. And what's very clear here too is that in the modern sector where this breaks down, people are clearly not as happy. And this is really getting into an aspect of life which you cannot quantify, and it's being very unscientific, but I insist on doing that. And interesting thing that I seem to have experienced there is that altruism as we know it doesn't really have any place in the traditional context. When you live in such a closely knit society where reciprocity and cooperation is a way of life, where also you do not view yourself as a separate, distinct entity, certainly not in the same extent that we do in industrial culture, then altruism in that sense doesn't have a role. And I also now find in the modern context where people find themselves thrown into an individualistic context in society, that altruism is sorely lacking, and that there's a lack of understanding for altruism, so that some of the Westerners, for instance, or even I myself, who come here to Ladakh to do something which of course is not purely unselfish, but it's relatively, seen from their eyes, strange that we would come halfway across the world just to help this society survive. And that then, in the modern context, is viewed, or well, generally in Ladakh is viewed as something rather odd.